Dennis, why don't you get started?
Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Galucki and welcome to the 421st Imagine Buffalo, now our virtual summer series featuring New York State Congressman Brian Higgins today. We are focusing on the theme, creating a culture of sustainability. Thank you so much for joining us today. Imagine Buffalo was created over a decade ago by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Our program is hosted by our wonderful Buffalo and Erie County Public Library system and is now in a virtual format since last September. We're going to start with our speaker shortly, but first, a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted during our speaker's presentation, which will run about 15 minutes or so. We will have time for questions at the end. So if you do have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. This program is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it again later on the library's Facebook and YouTube channels. And we invite you to share the link with your friends and networks. As a reminder, we'll be here on Zoom, life willing, every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. with a great lineup of local speakers. Now, one of our two themes the Imagine series has focused on over the years is to imagine a healthy, wealthy, and sustainable community. What would a sustainable community look like? That's what this series, this summer series, is looking to at least get opinions about. And our speakers come from the education field, the private and nonprofit sectors, as well as today's speaker from the public sector. Our featured speaker is U.S. Congressman Brian Higgins, serving New York's 26th Congressional District, which includes portions of Erie and Niagara counties. Brian Higgins is a strong advocate for policies important to both our region as well as our nation. Considered to be the principal architect of waterfront development in Buffalo and Western New York, Congressman Higgins led the fight for $250 million federal relicensing settlement from the New York Power Authority that continues to finance the transformation of Buffalo's long neglected inner and outer harbor waterfront areas. In the 117th Congress, Brian serves on the House Committee on Ways and Means, on the subcommittees on Health, Trade, and Social Security, In addition, he currently serves as a member of the House Committee on the Budget. Brian Higgins is chair of the Canada-US Interparliamentary Group and co-chair of the Northern Border Caucus. Additionally, the Congressman serves as one of 4 co-chairs of the bipartisan House Cancer Caucus, and he is a member of the Great Lakes Task Force, the House Manufacturing Caucus, the Northeast Midwest Congressional Coalition as well. Brian Higgins is also a good friend of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, and we thank him especially for joining our special summer series today. So now let's welcome United States Congressman Brian Higgins.
Thanks, Dennis and Melissa and Joy and JD. Good to have you with us. Dennis brought up the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. I have fond memories of doing research on local history. I taught history and economics at Buffalo State College, and the college let me write and teach a course called the Economic History of Buffalo and Western New York. And there was a rare books section in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. I think the curator was Dr. Bill Lose. And I used to spend many Saturday and Sunday in the archives there. And I'd try to take books out. He would very quickly remind me that these books do not circulate. I could use them in the library, but only the library. So I have a great fondness for education and for the great personnel we have at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. In my experience, no one is more helpful and more patient than librarians. It's incredible the soft guiding hand that they offer anybody that's in search of knowledge, be it about their family, be it about their country, be it about the world. And so it's a great resource that we have. I'm pleased to be here. Since I brought up the class, I will talk about Buffalo. And, you know, Buffalo 120 years ago was among the largest economies in the entire nation. If you think about all the building architects, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, Richard Upjohn, Henry Hobson Richardson, none of them were from Buffalo. They came to Buffalo because we exuded as a city a confidence that said that these great artists that were world-renowned architects, you could get your vision turned into something real, something tangible in this magical place called Buffalo in Western New York. And it was extraordinary. John Albright came here. He brought steel making. He helped harness the natural resources of our region to turn the natural environment into power. And he gave us the beautiful Albright Knox Art Gallery, which is now grown and is undergoing $150 million expansion and improvement. So I think Buffalo has an extraordinary history, but a lot of it was influenced by the water and the natural environment. And I think over the years, because of the industrialization of the American economy in the earlier and mid 20th century, we trusted the generosity of the land, the water, and the air, and we took its replenishment for granted. And now from Love Canal to the Buffalo River, we've experienced its vulnerability to abuse and its potential for giving us new life slipping away. The federal government, under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which I had a hand in helping to make, spent about $100 million to clean up the Buffalo River. You know, before the Clean Water Act of 1971-72, industry along the Buffalo River, steel, grain, chemical industry, they would dump poison chemicals right into the Buffalo River. When the Clean Water Act was enacted after the first Earth Day in April 22nd of 1970, you can't do that anymore. The problem was that we were stuck as a community, all of us, with the cleanup bill for that, because most of the industry had gone bankrupt or ceased to exist anymore. So we spent $100 million removing, literally, through dredging, chemical contamination in the Buffalo River. we remove 62,000 semi-truckloads of contaminated waste from the Buffalo River. Here's the good thing. All the industry's gone from the Buffalo River. What's replacing it today is a series of parks, open land, access points for canoes, for kayaks, and people are enjoying the Buffalo River. It's no longer the Great Lakes freighters, it's recreational boating. In the appropriations bill last night, we approved money for the river line for Buffalo, which will help communities that have not had access to their waterfront for decades to have direct quality access to their waterfront. Generally speaking, the Buffalo River, as Dennis had mentioned very early on, we went through the New York Power Authority, sought a new license from the federal government to own and operate the Niagara Power Project for another 50 years back when I was first elected in Congress. So we went after them to get a substantial settlement, which we argued cheap electricity led to the industrialization of areas like Buffalo, but also its waterfront. And therefore its decline and the air, water, and land pollution that came with it was worthy of what we refer to as a mitigation settlement. And I found a section in the Federal Power Act that said, if a power company, in this case, the New York Power Authority, seeks a license or a license renewal, the local community, Buffalo and Western New York, could seek a mitigation settlement. So I offered a bill which sought to bring $1 billion to Buffalo for waterfront development. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of support, but we were able to get a negotiated settlement of $300 million. And as Dennis said, it has and continues to rebuild Buffalo's waterfront, both in the inner harbor at Canal Side, but also at the outer harbor as well. And there have been a lot of good additions, a lot of public debate about these issues, which is a good thing. We have made progress. We've learned from some mistakes that were made, but I think we're in a much better place in terms of downtown Buffalo, in terms of the waterfront, both inner and outer harbor, Lake Erie, and the rivers as well, a better place than we've been in a long time. Here's the problem. Buffalo, prior to the pandemic, was the talk of the nation. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, The Economist, People magazine were doing major stories extolling the virtues of the new Buffalo. For the first time in 40 years, the population of young Buffalo is increasing, not decreasing. The fastest growing neighborhood in all of Western New York is downtown Buffalo. Young people are coming back to our community. We're not demolishing these beautiful architectural gems because of lack of interest. We are redeveloping them from their office use, from their industrial use, to residential and commercial mixed uses. But some neighborhoods remain neglected. There are 41,000 homes in Buffalo that have lead pipe carrying fresh water that then poisons that water into drinking water. 41,000 homes in Buffalo. The American Rescue Plan provides the city of Buffalo with money to replace all of those with non-lead water pipes. We have too many communities that don't have access to high-speed internet. Somewhat, to some people, a nebulous term, but it packs a powerful punch. Unless you have access to high-speed internet, high-speed broadband, you can't use the internet for educational purposes. You can't use the internet for telemedicine, healthcare purposes. You can't use the internet for transportation purposes and for social purposes. Everybody needs access to high-speed quality broadband. You can't become tech literate unless you have access. You can't get a tech job unless you have access. You can't get a tech career unless you have access. The rescue bills that we just approved will help us address that issue fundamentally in the city of Buffalo. Probably the most historic and powerful force for good is the bill that was approved in the American Rescue Plan to provide a child tax credit. Essentially what it is, it's Social Security for kids. It will lift, according to Columbia University, 50% of those kids in Buffalo and nationally who are now stuck in poverty. It will lift them out of poverty. It's good for the good that it will do, but it's also good for the nation's economy in two ways. Pulls kids out of poverty, gives them dignity, gives them a sense of purpose, that even though they were born into poverty, they don't have to live in poverty. Not in this nation and not in this community. It will help them become socially mobile. All the studies have been done by economists that when kids have money, you look at literature, you look at song, you look at art, there's a correlation between a hole in the belly and a gun in your hand. That happens, and that's because of poverty. So we're going to lift kids out of poverty, and it will do for the young people of this community and of this nation what Social Security did for America's older population. Before Social Security, 50% of older Americans lived in poverty. Now they don't. It's about 98% are out of poverty because of a good program. Here's the other thing. It makes good economic sense. There are studies out of the University of Chicago, the University of California at Davis, the University of Indiana. They all say that the benefit cost of Social Security for kids is for every dollar that you spend to pull them out of poverty, you get $7 in economic growth. That is a 700% return on the investment that you made. Now, let me compare that to something. In 2017, as you remember, there was a tax cut that was disproportionately for corporations. I did not support it. The economic analysis of that tax cut done by a conservative economist by the name of Mark Zandi with Moody's Analytics. Mark Zandi was also the economic advisor to John McCain when he ran for president. You know what he said? Conservative economists. For every dollar that you gave away to those corporations, you could expect to produce 33 cents in economic growth. Your loss in investment in doing that, which was all deficit financed, was 67%. So you do programs like pulling kids out of poverty, like infrastructure, the multiplier effect pays for the expenditure that you've made, without which you wouldn't get the growth. So Americans have to learn, I think, a very, very hard lesson. And I hear my colleagues oftentimes talking about, China, what are we gonna do about China? They cheat on their currency. They have a horrible human rights record. They don't treat their environment well. They don't treat their people well. But you know what China is doing that we're not doing? They're investing in the growth of their own economy. We're just about to finish a war in Afghanistan that went on for 20 years. Guess who you're negotiating for peace with in Afghanistan? The Taliban, a terrorist organization that we took out of control of Afghanistan 20 years ago. But the thing that concerns me even more than that, we spent $2 trillion, $2 trillion. None of it budgeted, all off budget, meaning it was deficit financed. It didn't produce one American job. It didn't pull one kid out of poverty. It didn't rebuild a waterfront in any American city like Buffalo and Western New York. It didn't promote arts and culture. It didn't educate anybody. How do we let that happen? How do we let that happen? So my hope is, in my vision for the city, with this new money that's coming in from the federal government, that we can build back stronger, that Buffalo can, again, in post-pandemic, be the talk of the nation. But this time, our rebuilding will be more equitable and will be more inclusive to those areas that the first Buffalo Renaissance just bypassed. We don't truly have a Renaissance unless everybody participates in it. We have too many young people who have been forgotten, who are in neighborhoods that need our help. And all of us, regardless of what your political persuasion may be, we should want for everybody, economic independence and self-sufficiency. And the only way that you can accomplish that is to make them accessible to the technology that's available to everybody else that makes them productive. Give them clean drinking water that comes into their homes so they don't experience cognitive damage because water's coming in through lead pipes. Give them a city to believe in, pull them out of poverty so that we can all fulfill the promise that this great community offers all of us. Let me just, Dennis, before we open up for questions, let me talk about the pandemic for a minute. For the first 6 months of 2021, we had thousands of COVID deaths in Erie County. For the past 3 weeks, we've had none, not one. I was with Candace Johnson the other day from Roswell for a different event, but we were talking about this, and this vaccine that is now available to all of us is a result of a technology called messenger RNA. And messenger RNA is essentially the stuff that tells a cell to make a protein, which is the active ingredient in the vaccine. So you're vaccinated, you get in contact with the virus. This vaccine neutralizes or kills that virus before it can penetrate a cell. If it can't penetrate a cell, it's harmless to you. If you have been vaccinated fully, you have very strong immunity against giving COVID or getting COVID. That's what the science says. All of us in the United States and in Canada have been admonished for the past 16 months to follow the science, follow the data, follow the facts. Look at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention today, largest public health agency in the entire world. If you're fully vaccinated, you can go back to pre-pandemic activity. You don't have to wear a face mask. You don't have to socially distance. You don't have to quarantine. This is not my opinion. It's their guidance as it relates to this. But in terms of biomedical advancement, this vaccine and the messenger RNA, established by a very humble Hungarian biomedical researcher, is one of the greatest medical achievements in the past 100 years. And it's allowed us to get back to a sense of normalcy, that we don't have to die of COVID, that we don't have to shut down the economy because of COVID, that there is life after this pandemic. And we should all look at this. We should all look at this as an opportunity. Keep in mind, I talked about those building architects before. There was another architect, he was a landscape architect by the name of
Mr. Olmstead.
Frederick Olmstead. What people don't realize is he came to Buffalo with the intent to build one park. But it was a time in post-pandemic when Buffalo just went through 4 iterations of cholera, which is gastrointestinal waterborne disease that killed disproportionately most of the people that lived along the Buffalo waterfront, or a lot of them, because at that time, the closer you lived to the water, the poorer you were, not the wealthier. But what Buffalo did in that post-pandemic era, it said, Mr. Olmstead, we don't want one park. we want you to build a park system. Because what people don't realize about Frederick Olmstead is he came to landscape architecture late in his life. First, he was a journalist for what is now the New York Times. He covered the pre-Civil War South. He co-founded The Nation, the longest running progressive magazine in the United States. And he was also in the Civil War a public health worker. And because of that, Olmstead believed in the powerful healing power of parks. So he came to Buffalo. Buffalo felt ambitious coming out of this cholera pandemic and charged him with building a park system. And if you notice in the Olmstead parks, that are connected by parkways, there are no gates, there are no fences, and there are no walls, because he believed that these parks had to be accessible to all, regardless of their socioeconomic status. He believed that everybody should enjoy the healing power of parks and the social cohesion that comes with that as well. And I'm just challenging my colleagues in government and our community to think big and ambitious about this city, generally speaking, but particularly as we enter, hopefully, the final stages of this pandemic to a new day of greater health that is more bike, more green, and more pedestrian. I'll take any questions you guys may have.
Well,
And any-
thank you. Thank you, Congressman Higgins, and a great overview of Buffalo. JD, why don't you get us started? Folks, if you have any questions, please get them into the chat box and we'll do the best we can to answer them. JD?
Yeah, thanks again, Brian. And thank you very much for, introducing the social justice component into the conversation about creating a culture of sustainability. It's essential. I do want to get back just to more environmental matter. You mentioned about, water quality, and thanks for all your help in improving the water quality here in Lake Erie and, the West New York area. I want to talk a little bit about water quantity. I'm an investment guy, and if I could own anything in the world right now, it would be fresh water. And with an increasingly, a rapidly rising Earth's surface temperature and an increasingly parched Southwest and West, my concern is around bulk water diversion. Do you have any perspective on that? Anything brewing in the federal government to either, promote that bulk diversion or to prevent it from happening?
Yeah, the Ohio state legislature 7 years ago attempted to divert a lot of water from the Great Lakes to other regions, and they wanted to sell it. And we helped to stop it at the federal level. But JD, I will tell you, we're constantly under threat because of that. These algae blooms are a big concern of mine. And, they're in the Lake Erie Basin in Toledo, but here's what we know. Every year, because of, urban runoff, agricultural runoff, they proliferate and they move. And we are pursuing a demonstration project right now that was used in a lake in Florida. It's basically a float, cut and recycle the algae bloom. But we are constantly, hang on one second. Sorry about that. We are constantly under threat because when you have such an abundance of fresh water, you look at what's going on in California right now. I mean, they have drought. There are some regions, agricultural regions in California that don't have water. That's what the big fight is. People will talk about, the strengths and weaknesses of a region. Our biggest problem melts. So protecting, I always say you can't successfully develop a waterfront community on polluted waterways and waterways that are constantly under threat of being diverted to another place, which may solve their problem, but in the end will just create a bigger problem for all of us. So it's not about being selfish. It's about conserving the great natural resources that we have here. I mentioned earlier, Love Canal, inactive hazardous waste sites. Buffalo used to have more inactive hazardous waste sites along the waterfront than any region in all of New York State. That's changed a lot because of Superfund and other initiatives, but it's cost us, all of us, the public, a lot of money to fight these efforts, both the pollution of our waters and the diversion of it. And I think there's a tendency for us just to kind of take for granted that all of these resources, particularly the water, is going to be, plentiful all the time. And we learned 7 years ago that legislatures, in seeking money, want to divert Great Lakes water to regions so that they can accrue a financial gain. I think, the best thing about the waterfront is the water. And the more we can get people, to the water in quality ways. And what have we learned here? JD, you're a biker. I mean, you ride with a bike. Last time I saw you was down at Rick Smith's place.
Mhm.
But people are looking for those opportunities. And what I want to try to do with, Canal Side, the Outer Harbor, and the Buffalo River corridor is to make that more fluid, to make that more accessible. So it is a total experience. And I think the industrial nature of the waterfront makes waterfront exploration that much more interesting. That you've got good quality bike trails, that you have places intermittently along the way to stop and enjoy the Buffalo waterfront adds tremendously to the quality of life. And what I see is an outer harbor that is a generous complement of parks and public places to complement the more densely developed downtown Buffalo. But accessibility to the outer harbor, it's not impossible, but you've got to figure it out a little bit. Whatever we can do to make that more accessible and a better quality of life, working with, Go Bike Buffalo to try to find more access from the neighborhoods into downtown Buffalo. Give an example, JD. South Buffalo, West Seneca, and Lackawanna is a population center of 90,000 people. It is very hard to get to the outer harbor on a bicycle from South Buffalo, Lackawanna, and West Seneca. So we have to improve access to and through the waterfront as well. And the reason I bring that up is to point, is specific to your question. When people enjoy the waterfront, they develop an innate appreciation for what makes up the waterfront. And the more access you have, the more you want to protect it. So we have to be vigilant. Ohio and their state legislature is not the only Great Lakes state that has tried to divert water from the Great Lakes. I have no idea why the state of Ohio gets New York Power Authority power that's generated at Niagara Falls. They can never convince me that that is justified. But that's the thirst you have out there for fresh water, not only as a source of drinking water and recreation, but also for things like hydroelectricity as well.
So I'm going to jump in with a question that came from John. In the interest of creating a culture of sustainability, would you continue the protection of the Great Lakes started by microbeads bans in Erie County, then passed on the federal law? Would you join Representative Alan Lowenthal and 104 House members who've co-sponsored the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act? It is sustainable by adding a national bottle bill to raise collection rates of #1 plastics from around 20% in non-bottle bill states to a minimum of 60 to 90%, depending upon the deposit. The Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act also has a mandatory minimum recycled content on packaging and an extended producer responsibility law that would free up money for local governments, as the EPR law makes producers of packaging responsible for the entire life cycle. This goes on and on.
Yeah.
That's a very thoughtful question, and the answer is yes. The damage that's been done to the natural environment, particularly waterfront regions, as it relates to plastics, is unconscionable, and you can't be more aggressive in trying to address that, as Alan has done. He's a friend of mine in Congress, and I've talked to him about this bill as well. But to answer the questioner's question, yes, I can and will support that bill.
Okay, so now asking a question from Betty, who's going to move from the water over to the green spaces. Do you think we will be getting the Humboldt Parkway back again?
Well, how could a community back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when America and Western New Yorkers had an obsession with the automobile, destroy communities because they took away the grandest parkway of all of the parkways that Frederick Olmstead designed for Buffalo? Here's what I do know. This is the first time in 50 years that there is a specific item in the transportation bill. It's called the American Jobs Plan, but that's essentially the infrastructure bill. Now, we need about $4.6 trillion just to bring the nation's infrastructure to a state of good repair. Joe Biden's proposal to Congress, which is not yet passed Congress, is $2.2 trillion. They're negotiating the wrong way. They're going down from 2.2, despite the fact that you need 4.6. How does that make any sense? But there is a provision in there providing billions of dollars to fix those parkways, those neighborhoods that were destroyed by expressway building, because it occurred all over the nation. And back, before the environmental laws that gave people a say in these kinds of projects, the environmental review process, environmental impact studies and statements, these highway buildings just built these expressways through neighborhoods to move wealth to wealth and didn't care what the consequence was. So I'm working with ROC. It's a good organization that's been in place for about 10 years. We're going to do everything that we can to replace Humboldt Parkway, which was ripped from that community several decades ago. So to answer the question, yes, I believe it can be done and it must be done. It's a social justice issue. It's a moral issue, but it's also a life quality issue in the city of Buffalo. When you talk about forgotten neighborhoods, they include the places where parks and parkways were taken from them without any, neighborhood input. You think about if we didn't have, expressways built by Robert Moses, we had expressways that were inspired by Robert Moses. The Robert Moses Parkway up in Niagara Falls it's not a parkway. It never was. It's an 18.6 mile elevated section of highway that we advocated for the removal of to make it a park. But think about what it did to those neighborhoods that were destroyed by that elevated section of highway that blocked the city of Niagara Falls from arguably the greatest waterfront in the world. Think about that. And what's happening today, because the Robert Moses Expressway was removed, and it's now an at-grade parkway, guess what? People in the city of Niagara Falls are using that for recreational purposes. There's more investment in and around that project today than there was in the past 50 years. And that's what these projects do. So I believe strongly that Scajaquada should be brought as an at-grade parkway to bring the parts of Delaware Park that were destroyed, that were dissected because of expressway building. So that whole corridor, the 198, the 33, the Scajaquada, the Kensington, call it what you will. As far as I'm concerned, given the fact that when they were built, the city of Buffalo's population was at a peak. It was 580,000, right? Today it's 260,000. Think about the Skagakwa Expressway for a moment. 5 years ago, the expressway speed limit was reduced to 30 miles an hour because of a horrible, tragic accident that had nothing to do with speed. The driver had an issue relative to, he basically fell asleep. My point is this: for 5 years, the Skagakwa Expressway speed limit is no more than that of an adjacent side street. So if you bring the Skagakwa and Humboldt Parkway to an at-grade parkway, if you institute the new technology that's available relative to signal synchronization, you reduce commute times by 30%. You reduce wait times at intersections by 40%. You reduce pollution from automobiles by 20%. And we know the technology exists because you know where it is? It's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we should be smart about our transportation future and position the city to make smart decisions. But because of the social injustice that was inflicted on a community of color, many, many decades ago, that issue must and will be addressed.
Thank you. We've got a question from Mark about what are your thoughts on when that Peace Bridge will open so folks can get into Canada?
Yeah, well, let me just say this to you, Mark. I said this before, and it's a good question. And I have two obligations on that issue. One is to be brutally honest with people, my people, the people I represent, and to also keep trying. You know, there was just a poll. In fact, the Buffalo News is going to do a story on this. Now, 2/3 of Canadians are saying that the Peace Bridge should be open. The northern border crossing should be open. And that is very different from where public opinion was in Canada, and including the province of Ontario 2 months ago. Now, think about this. Again, all of us, Canadians and Americans, we're told, follow the science, follow the facts, follow the data. Science, facts, and data say the same thing. If you are fully vaccinated, you have very strong immunity against giving COVID or getting COVID. That needs to be recognized and celebrated and acknowledged. Now, the Prime Minister, I've met him. He's a good man. But you've got politics going on in Canada. The province of Ontario, which is everything from Fort Erie north to the Greater Toronto area, is the premier there is a conservative by the name of Doug Ford. The Prime Minister is a liberal by the name of Justin Trudeau. They will likely have federal elections in October. They are being uber cautious. Why? Because a spike in COVID cases would obviously have a political influence, as it did here in the United States. One administration, the way they handled it poorly, and a marked improvement by the new administration is evidenced by the fact that we have fewer deaths, fewer cases, and we're leading the world in vaccinations. So that has to be acknowledged. Here's the rub. There are loved ones on both sides of the border that have been separated from each other for the past 16 months. They should be considered an essential traveler. There are people that own cottages from Buffalo in Bay Beach, Crystal Beach, Thunder Bay, all those places. I grew up most of my summers on the Canadian shores of Lake Erie because that was the tradition in Buffalo. People would, if you could buy a cottage, you bought it. If you could rent it. Some people bought homes. They should be able to travel. Oh, no, we can't do that because that would be dangerous. Oh, really? And then you give National Hockey League players an exemption, not because of the science, but because of the National Hockey League's playoff schedule. And then you're going to give the Toronto Blue Jays an exemption because Toronto wants their team back. That's arbitrary. That doesn't follow the science. So my point is this. We push very aggressively. I push personally, the White House, to give our Canadian friends 1 million doses of Moderna, the vaccine. 85, 90, 95% effective. I wanted to open up Western New York to allow Canadians who wanted to be vaccinated and couldn't to come to Buffalo, get vaccinated, and go right back. During a pandemic, it would seem to me that they should be deemed an essential traveler if they're trying to protect themselves and their family. Guess what we did with those surplus vaccines? We threw them out because we couldn't use them. The supply out led the demand. So, you know, we just need to be smart about this stuff. So to answer your question, there's an important date coming up. It's July 21st. And there's only two people that can make this decision, truthfully. And that is the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada. And on behalf of both nations, in a binational spirit, they should open up the border to all of those who've been fully vaccinated, because this vaccine, as I've said many times, is a powerful medicine against this disease. You have strong immunity, even with all the variants, including the Delta variant. You still have 80% effectiveness. You know, think about this, a seasonal flu vaccine is about 45 to 50% effective. When biomedical researchers went into trying to develop a vaccine for this, their hope would be that they would be able to develop a vaccine that was 60 to 75% effective. 85, 90, 95%. The prestigious science journal Nature just did a feature story about 3 weeks ago. And they said that if you had COVID and recovered from it and the antibodies, and then were subsequently vaccinated, you may not require a booster shot for decades and potentially a lifetime. The journal Nature, not my opinion. That has to be recognized somehow. The other thing is, look, if people are vaccine skeptics or they're afraid of needles, that's a real thing. You know, maybe if being fully vaccinated is a ticket to cross the border, that would serve as a strong incentive for people that may not otherwise get vaccinated. So I think it serves a lot of purposes. So, you know, just you can't for 16 months tell us to follow the science, and we're following the science, and just say, well, we can't open the border again. Yes, you can, and you should, and it should be on July 21st. And truthfully, it's not only about economics, although that's very, very important, between the United States and Canada. It's about life quality. It's about mental health. It's about humane treatment of people that have been forced to be separated. And it's, if you have two people that love each other, and one's in Canada and one's in the United States, and they can't be reunited, and they're both fully vaccinated, what risk do they pose as it relates to this pandemic? I would argue virtually nothing. And look, I'm not a scientist, but you know, I do have an obligation to understand this stuff. And this vaccine, these vaccines, I should say, give you powerful immunity against both getting COVID and giving COVID. And don't take my word for it, I'm a politician. But go to the CDC website and you will see, and I say that the language is clear, concise, it's explicit. You can go back to pre-pandemic activity if you're fully vaccinated. You don't have to wear a mask if you're fully vaccinated. You don't have to worry about variants if you're fully vaccinated. You don't have to socially distance if you're fully vaccinated. You don't have to quarantine if you're fully vaccinated. I'm following the science. Those that told us to follow it should follow it as well.
Thank you, Congressman. We'll keep our fingers crossed for July 21st. I have a few more questions here. Can we all go till 1:30? Are you okay with that, Congressman?
I am, sure.
Another 10, 15 minutes. So Bill writes, thank you for your great and consistent support of clean energy in Congress. Your support of geothermal heating and cooling is much appreciated. I love the way you talk right down to taking care of real people and real issues, especially the focus on child poverty and the $300 monthly checks. Regarding taking care of our kids, my son is teaching in a public school on the west side. There's no air conditioning. Kids can learn well and teachers can teach well. but it's hard to teach in a sweltering room. The schools did some major building renovations a decade ago, but didn't take into account cooling while the climate is rapidly warming. Is there funding that you're aware of for geothermal heating and cooling in our schools?
Without question, I know who that questioner is because he's a guy that a long time ago instilled in me an appreciation for the waterfront. His name's Bill Noack. He was on the city council staff, and Bill and I collaborated, mostly him, not me, in writing a redevelopment plan for the Buffalo waterfront. And that was in 1988. And Bill has been a real leader on these issues. Bill, there is never going to be more money today than there is in the history before this and the history that awaits us. That would be a very valuable and eligible use for the stimulus money the Board of Education is getting. It's nearly $300 million. You can do a lot of heating and air conditioning conversions in those buildings. They don't have to be demolished. Those are beautiful buildings in many cases, architecturally significant, but you do have to keep pace so that the air conditioning heating systems are modern, are clean, and they're efficient. And Bill's been a leader on that issue. And Bill, you're an activist. You're not passive. I know that from my. And please communicate very clearly with both the Board of Education, which I think they held a hearing the night before last on ideas to use the $300 million. The city of Buffalo has $350 million. As Bill knows from the Buffalo City Council days, the city makes a contribution to the Buffalo Board of Education. I could see a collaboration between the city and the school board to do those heat and air conditioning conversions to get the best, highest energy friendly and environmental friendly use from those conversions. So the answer to the question is absolutely, and there is no better time than the present. And whether it's the American Rescue Plan, whether it's the money coming directly to the city, it's also coming to the county as well. There may be a county component to that, but clearly those would be eligible uses, Billy, because you know that a lot of, the pandemic, there were lots of concerns. And one of the reasons why schools were closed for so long is the circulation of air, and a lot of these buildings that you think, I just read something the other day that because airplanes circulate air so frequently, the air quality in an airplane is better than it is in a hospital. And it just underscores the need to look at those issues, and particularly school buildings where you have not only teachers like Bill's son, but also you have kids that may be going back to a home that has lead piping in it. And they're really, we're tying those kids one hand at least behind their backs relative to becoming what they ultimately want to be. So the answer is yes, Bill.
So you mentioned lead. Jim asks us, he knows 20 years ago we were aware of the lead problem, but there was no money and no program. How will you ensure that now the money goes to the right places for removing lead piping and helping our children and families?
There is accountability. The city of Buffalo will have to certify that that is the purpose for which these dollars are going to be used. Again, with respect to replacing 41,000 homes in the city of Buffalo that now have lead pipe carrying drinking water into those homes, poisoning kids, every initiative that is delayed is relief denied. And we don't have the luxury of time. As the questioner said, 20 years ago, we can identify this problem. You can identify a problem with combined sewer overflows that are repolluting the waterways that we're cleaning up with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. This is the time to do that. There wasn't the money available 20 years ago. The city, to its considerable credit, before the pandemic, had a policy where, if there was a broken pipe, it could not be replaced with lead. So they were doing an incremental approach. Why were they doing that? Lack of resources. That is no longer the case. And that's why this American Rescue Plan, American Family Plan, the stimulus bills are so powerful because they address those communities that have been ignored, not only in Buffalo, but throughout the nation for too long, way too long.
Okay, a couple more here. This is from Hale. Commercial pharmaceutical companies generate the science and the data for COVID vaccines and for cancer drugs. Nutritional approaches do not have a similar ability to do research without public institutions and public funding. How can we promote nutritional therapies with science? I'm having problems with this going down the page. Science, research, trials, and data. So the question is, how can we promote nutritional therapies with science, research, trials, and data?
Well, just let me say this. Most of the research money for technology and for drugs, pharmaceuticals, does not come from the pharmaceutical industry. It comes from your tax dollars in terms of research, basic research, which is not profitable. That's the most expensive part of developing a drug or developing a technology. And then what happens when our tax dollars, through the federal government, the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute, develops drugs to a point where they reach a point of commercialization, guess who takes over? The pharmaceutical companies. Now, look, they have a role, but when pharmaceutical companies are appealing to consumers, they're not appealing to the science. They're appealing to emotion. Do you ever notice drugs that are being advertised on television for very serious chronic illnesses? Everybody's good looking, great music, it's always sunny, and everybody's happy. That is not real life. And the federal government deserves to be recognized. The Moderna vaccine, for example, in January of 2020, before the pandemic really took place, the shares of Moderna, who developed one of the vaccines, primarily with federal government research, the messenger RNA, their stock was at $6. It closed the other day at $220 a share in 16 months. That's a pretty good return on investment. That vaccine could not have been developed without the federal government. The same is true with technology. Do you know that every technology that you have in your smartphone, the internet, touchscreen technology, voice activated personal assistant, global positioning satellite, it didn't come from Steve Jobs and Apple. It came from DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Products Agency, financed with public dollars, your tax dollars. And then Steve Jobs took all of that technology, commercialized it, and made 1 billion smartphones in China. So I just think that, the federal government doesn't do everything right, but it does a lot of things that nobody else will do that makes our lives better and could help make us healthier as well.
Two more quick questions, if we're okay. This is one where I'm going to wear the library hat. If you're not aware, the Congressman has been a huge supporter of libraries, and we appreciate that. We're going to remind you, Congressman, to reach out to Budget Committee Chair Yarmouth to ask that the Build America's Libraries Act, of which we know you are a co-sponsor of and already have signed on to your support, HR 1581, but we need it to be included in the upcoming budget resolution. I don't know if they're talking about that in Washington, but we'd hope that you could help to move that forward. And again, thank you for everything that you've done for libraries.
Thank you, Joy. John Yarmouth is a friend. I serve on the Budget Committee. He and I have talked about this very issue. He supports it. We have to get into this bill. Libraries are essential to a civil society. I can't tell you, just from a personal standpoint, how invaluable they are to me and my family, be it the central branch or the neighborhood branches. Those libraries saved a lot of us and gave us access to the books, the classics that we otherwise would not have had access to, because, when I grew up in South Buffalo, dad's a bricklayer, my mom was a school teacher, but we didn't have a lot of culture in our home because people were too busy working. So we went to the Casanova Library and we had just great access to traditional books. And now, as you know, the library has become so much more. Think about this for a moment. The George W. Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M in College City, Texas, has 4 million pieces of paper, personal correspondences, official letters, et cetera, et cetera. The Barack Obama Presidential Library will not have 1 sheet of paper. The whole thing will be digitized. Now think about what a sea change within a period of 8 years. And this is how technology has changed us. And I just give great credit to the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library for, the library that I used to go to visit Dr. Lose at the rare book section is a very different place than it is today. And you see it all over. You have a cafe now. They would never have a cafe in a library. I mean, think about that. But it's just, so much is digitized now. And it just makes research that much more accessible, enjoyable, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to preserving the traditional library foundation, which is the great books that you collect and care for.
Thank you so much for recognizing that. I'm going to wrap up the questions that have come from participants. Just to let you know that Dr. Bonney wants to welcome you to join the French Sister City organization. They have in-person and virtual exchanges in six areas, and you're welcome to get more information on it if you would like. On behalf of the library, thank you. I'll push it over now back to Dennis and JD, and it's all yours.
We're going to wrap it up. We're going to wrap it up as well, Joy. But Brian, I do want to get one question. It strikes me roughly a decade ago, we brought the 10 years ago, actually, exactly. We brought the National Trust for Historic Preservation into town. And it helped us as a community, looking back at it, change our culture of appreciation of the buildings that the rest of the world thought were pretty impressive and we kind of took for granted, perhaps. That, along with the restoration, successful restoration of the Martin House complex, the whole bit, now completed. My point is, if we're changing a culture, it strikes me as appreciation of what that culture could look like. I don't have all the words for it, but I think that's what the waterfront is doing for us. We're gaining appreciation. My question then from your standpoint very quickly is there a sense of unity between all of the communities in the Great Lakes watershed? I mean, think of the power of that political group, cross party lines, certainly, but to say our future isn't in tapping the Great Lakes, it's encouraging people to consider living in the watershed that feeds the Great Lakes, and doing it in a joint fashion. Is there any effort like that? Could we help organize such a significant effort, including the Canadian side, obviously, as well as the American?
Before I answer the question, just a quick, Frank Lloyd Wright, as you may have remembered, had a tremendous ego. I mean, he self-described as the greatest architect in the history of the world. Louis Sullivan, who designed the Guarantee Building and is viewed as the father of the modern skyscraper, actually fired Frank Lloyd Wright. The stated reason was not for lack of talent, but for lack of humility. No, but back to JD had asked this question before. We have a Great Lakes caucus, which is members, both Republican and Democrat, who represent Great Lakes communities. And then, JD, this is where the influence comes from in terms of lobbying the administration to push back on efforts like that of the state of Ohio. So it's a collection of members who have a common interest in the Great Lakes. So there is coordination, and it is, I think, effective, or it has been effective thus far. But as these problems with the shortage of water become more acute, that effort really has to be greatly enhanced in order to remain effective. So we are constantly vigilant about the great threat that's posed from the outside. And it's not to say that this is ours, you can't have any. Well, I guess it is kind of, but you don't want to, it's a precious resource that has been, as I said before, we've taken its generosity for granted, and we trusted that it would just naturally replenish itself. And when these efforts are made to divert water away, it has an ecological impact, it has an economic impact, it has a life quality impact. So the Great Lakes Caucus, again, bipartisan, made up of a lot of members, is very, very focused on preservation and enhancement of that great resource, natural resource that we have.
Well, that will wrap it up then. Thank you. Let's encourage folks to consider unifying our effort to invite people to join us in our Great Lakes watershed area, which Buffalo and other great cities and communities are a part of. All right, Joy, thank you for extending our normal half-hour time, and Brian, thank you again for being part of this program on imagining a culture of sustainability. Now, next week, we're going to have folks from the New York State Power Authority, and Leo Berman is the Senior Sustainability Project Coordinator for the New York Power Authority, and Louis Panassa is the Senior Director of Communication Affairs for the Niagara Power Authority. So join us next week. We'll see you at 12:30. Different link every time, Zoom link. So make sure you check that out. Check the library archive site, YouTube and Facebook, and you'll get this program and others that we've done both in this series and before. So thank you again all for participating and your great questions. I'm Dennis Galucki. Have a good day and be well.